The palace had not slept in 3 days. Music poured through the grand halls long after midnight, filling every corner of the royal residence with laughter and celebration. The decade-long war against the Eastern Pax was finally over. Victory belonged to the Moon Kingdom, and its greatest hero was Alpha King Adrian Thorne. Nobles lifted crystal goblets in endless toasts. Generals exchanged stories of the final battle. Servants hurried between tables carrying roasted meats, fresh bread, and bottles of sparkling wine. It was a night the kingdom would remember for generations. Far from the crowded banquet hall, Queen Evelyn Ashwood stood quietly in the royal kitchen. She smiled as fragrant steam rose from a small porcelain teapot, Adrian's favorite herbal blend. She had gathered the herbs herself from the palace garden only hours earlier. During the war, he often wrote that its familiar scent reminded him of home. She wanted his first peaceful night to begin with something made by her own hands. A young maid reached for the tray. "Your Majesty, please allow me." Evelyn shook her head gently. "I'll take it." The maid smiled. "His Majesty will be happy to see you." "I hope so," Evelyn whispered. Balancing the silver tray carefully, she walked through the quiet corridor leading toward the banquet chamber. The closer she came, the louder the voices became. She paused just outside the carved oak doors, as laughter echoed from within. One of Adrian's generals raised his voice above the celebration. "So, Your Majesty, now that the war is finally over, when will the kingdom hear the cries of a royal heir?" Several nobles laughed warmly. "You've been married for 3 years. The nursery has been ready since the wedding. When will the little prince or princess finally arrive?" Evelyn's cheeks warmed. She and Adrian had often spoken about children during the first year of their marriage. Late at night, they had imagined tiny footsteps racing through the palace gardens. Those conversations had quietly disappeared as the war grew worse. She had believed there would be time after peace returned. Inside the hall, the laughter slowly faded. Adrian set his wineglass on the table. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, almost emotionless. "I made a promise before becoming king." The room fell silent. "I will never bring a child into this marriage." Evelyn froze. One of the older nobles frowned. "Because you don't trust the queen?" Adrian slowly shook his head. "No." His next words were quiet enough that everyone leaned closer. "If my enemies ever discover I love my family, they'll become my greatest weakness." He stared into the dark wine swirling inside his cup. "So I made myself a promise. I will never let my Luna become a mother." The tray slipped from Evelyn's trembling hands. The porcelain cup shattered against the marble floor. Golden tea spread across the polished stone like spilled sunlight. Her breath caught painfully in her chest. She pressed both hands over her mouth before a single sob could escape. Inside the banquet hall, another burst of conversation erupted. No one heard the cup break beyond the heavy doors. No one knew she had been standing there. No one knew every carefully chosen word had reached her heart. Evelyn stumbled backward until the corridor hid her from the celebration. She leaned against the cold wall, struggling to breathe. It wasn't the decision alone that shattered her. It was the realization that Adrian had made it years ago, without asking her, without trusting her, without believing she deserved to choose the future they were supposed to share. Tears blurred her vision. The tea she had prepared with such love cooled across the empty hallway. Inside, the kingdom celebrated its victorious king. Outside, his queen quietly realized that the future she had dreamed of had already been taken from her. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the palace windows, Evelyn turned toward her chambers. For the first time since becoming queen, she knew she could not stay. The palace remained alive with celebration. Songs drifted through the corridors. Laughter echoed beneath the high stone ceilings. No one noticed that their queen walked through those same halls with silent tears on her face. Evelyn closed the door to her chambers behind her. For a long moment, she simply stood there. The room was filled with memories. a vase of moon lilies Adrian had given her on their first anniversary, a half-finished blanket she had been knitting for the child they once dreamed of, a shelf lined with books of lullabies and nursery tales she had collected over the years. She had never stopped hoping. Even when the war delayed their plans, she believed peace would bring the future they had imagined together. Now she knew that future had ended long before tonight. She wiped away her tears. Then she opened a small travel bag. She packed only what belonged to Evelyn. Simple dresses, a warm cloak, her mother's silver comb, a worn journal, a pouch of healing herbs. She left behind everything that belonged to the queen. Her jeweled crown rested upon its velvet cushion. The royal seal remained inside its carved wooden box. Necklaces, bracelets, and ceremonial robes stayed exactly where they had always been. None of them mattered anymore. She crossed the room one final time and sat at Adrian's writing desk. Taking a fresh sheet of parchment, she dipped her pen into ink. Her hand trembled only once. Then she wrote, "You had every right to fear losing your family. You never had the right to decide my future without me. I release you from every promise we made. Please don't look for me." She folded the letter neatly. No signature was necessary. He would recognize her handwriting immediately. Evelyn placed the letter in the center of the desk, beside the small carved wolf figurine Adrian had made for her during the first winter of their marriage. For a moment, she rested her fingertips against it. "I loved you," she whispered into the quiet room. "I only wish you had trusted me enough to let me stand beside your fears." She rose before her resolve could break. The palace was strangely peaceful before sunrise. Most of the servants were cleaning the banquet hall. The guards at the main entrance watched the outer courtyard, never expecting danger from within. Evelyn moved through forgotten passageways she had learned during her years in the palace. She wore a plain traveling cloak with the hood pulled low. No jewels, no crown, no sign that she was the Luna Queen. When she reached the old moon garden, she paused beneath the ancient willow tree, where Adrian had first confessed his love. The branches swayed gently in the early morning breeze. She smiled through fresh tears. Then she turned away. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the palace towers, Evelyn Ashwood was gone. Hours later, Adrian entered his chambers, exhausted from the endless celebrations. He expected to find Evelyn asleep. Instead, the room was silent. His eyes fell upon the folded letter waiting on his desk. As he read each line, the color drained from his face. "No," he whispered. He searched every room himself before raising the alarm. The palace gates had never opened. No horses were missing. The guards had seen nothing. Tracking wolves followed every scent they could find. Each trail disappeared inside the palace gardens, as though the moon goddess herself had hidden Evelyn's footsteps from the world. For the first time since surviving the battlefield, Adrian felt something far more terrifying than war. He had won a kingdom, but before dawn, he had lost the woman who had always been his home. The search lasted for weeks. Royal scouts crossed every border. Tracking wolves followed faint scents through forests, villages, and mountain trails. Messengers carried Evelyn's portrait to neighboring kingdoms. Every report ended the same way. Nothing. It was as if the queen had disappeared into the wind. The palace grew quieter with each passing day. The banquet hall that had once echoed with celebration now stood empty. Adrian stopped attending feasts. He no longer lingered in the throne room after council meetings. Each evening, he returned to the chambers that still carried Evelyn's gentle touch. Her favorite books remained neatly arranged on the shelf. The unfinished blanket rested in its basket beside the window. The scent of dried lavender still lingered in the air. He found himself reaching for her more than once, only to remember the room was empty. One rainy afternoon, the royal archivist requested a private audience. The old scholar entered, carrying a weathered wooden chest sealed with the royal crest. "I have kept this since your father's passing," he said softly. "He instructed me to give it to you Only when I believed you were ready. Adrian frowned. Why now? The archivist looked at him with quiet sadness. Because grief has finally taught you what victory could not. When the old man left, Adrian broke the wax seal. Inside lay a worn leather journal. Its pages faded with age. It belonged to his father, the late Alpha King. Adrian turned the pages slowly until one entry caught his attention. It described a campaign from many years before. His mother had been expecting another child. The kingdom celebrated the coming heir. Then everything changed. Enemy spies learned of the pregnancy. Unable to defeat the kingdom in battle, they struck where it hurt most. Adrian's older brother had been kidnapped. The royal family was thrown into despair. His father abandoned the battlefield to rescue his son. The prince was saved. But the terror and grief were too much for Adrian's mother. She lost the child she carried. Adrian swallowed hard as he continued reading. The final pages had been written after her funeral. His father's handwriting was shakier than before. I wanted to protect my family. Instead, fear made every choice for me. If my son ever reads this, tell him never to let fear become another king. Tucked inside the journal was a second piece of parchment. It contained only one memory. Adrian recognized it instantly. His father's final words before dying. Protect your family. For years, Adrian believed those words meant keeping his future children from ever existing. He thought denying himself a family was the greatest sacrifice a king could make. Now he understood. His father had never meant to choose fear. He had meant to cherish those he loved while they were still beside him. Adrian closed the journal, his hands trembling. He remembered every conversation Evelyn had started about children, every hopeful smile, every dream she had shared. He had listened, then quietly buried those dreams without telling her why. Not because he didn't love her, because he loved her so much that fear had convinced him silence was protection. But silence had protected nothing. It had only left her alone. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The captain of the royal guard entered. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "we've searched every province. There is still no sign of the Queen." Adrian looked once more at his father's journal. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She didn't abandon me." The captain remained silent. Adrian stared toward the rain falling beyond the palace windows. "I sent her away long before she ever walked out those gates." And for the first time since Evelyn disappeared, he stopped asking where she had gone. Instead, he finally understood why. Spring arrived in the valley long before anyone noticed the stranger. She came on foot. Her traveling cloak was worn from months of walking. Dust covered her boots. The woman carried only a small leather bag filled with herbs, bandages, and a weathered journal. When the village elder asked her name, she smiled gently. "Please call me Lady Eve." No one asked another question. The valley had become a refuge for people who had lost everything during the war. Widows, orphans, former soldiers, families whose homes had been reduced to ashes. Everyone carried a past they preferred not to speak about. Lady Eve fit in perfectly. Within days, she began tending to the sick. She gathered wild herbs from the hillsides before sunrise. She brewed medicines for fevers. She stitched torn wounds with careful hands. She stayed beside frightened children until nightmares faded into sleep. The villagers soon discovered she possessed remarkable knowledge. "Where did you learn all this?" an old farmer asked one afternoon. Lady Eve smiled as she crushed dried lavender into a healing salve. "My mother believed every life was worth saving, so she made sure I knew how." The answer satisfied everyone. As the months passed, the valley slowly changed. Lady Eve organized the rebuilding of abandoned cottages. She convinced the strongest villagers to plant apple and pear trees where burned fields once stood. She gathered the children beneath the oldest oak tree every afternoon. Using pieces of charcoal and smooth wooden boards, she taught them letters, numbers, and stories. Many had never held a book before. To them, learning felt like discovering magic. One little girl tugged gently on Lady Eve's sleeve. "Will you ever leave us?" Evelyn's heart tightened. She looked around at the smiling faces surrounding her. For the first time in years, no one expected perfection from her. No one bowed. No one called her Your Majesty. They simply needed her. She knelt beside the little girl. Not anytime soon. The child wrapped tiny arms around her neck. The simple embrace nearly brought Evelyn to tears. She had spent 3 years trying to become the perfect queen, always graceful, always composed, always putting the kingdom before herself. Here, no one cared whether she knew royal etiquette. They cared that she remembered birthdays, that she sat beside lonely elders during supper, that she laughed with the children while planting seedlings in the orchard. For the first time since leaving the palace, Evelyn felt something she had almost forgotten: peace. Nearly 2 years slipped quietly by. The orchard bloomed with white blossoms each spring. The school beneath the great oak grew larger. The villagers no longer called their home a refugee settlement. They called it their future. One bright afternoon, 3 travelers entered the valley, wearing dusty cloaks. They introduced themselves as merchants looking for fresh produce. In truth, they were royal spies searching every corner of the kingdom for their missing queen. They purchased apples, complimented the new schoolhouse, even accepted medicine from Lady Eve after one claimed to have an aching shoulder. She smiled kindly as she handed him the herbal ointment. "Apply this twice a day." "Thank you," the man replied. None of them recognized the woman standing before them. The elegant queen whose portrait still hung in the royal palace had disappeared. In her place stood a humble healer with sun-kissed skin, work-worn hands, and a peaceful smile. As the spies rode away, Evelyn watched them disappear beyond the hills. She felt no fear, only gratitude. At last, she had discovered the woman she was always meant to become. Unseen by the world, yet finally seen by herself. Nearly 2 years had passed since Evelyn disappeared. The palace no longer searched with the frantic desperation of the first months. Instead, the search had become quiet, steady, relentless. Adrian refused to close the reports that arrived on his desk each week. He read every one himself. Even the smallest rumor was investigated. Most led nowhere. Some ended in disappointment. None led to Evelyn. Then, one stormy evening, the captain of the Royal Intelligence Service requested an urgent audience. He carried a bundle of sealed documents recovered during a raid on the estate of a disgraced noble. They weren't looking for treasure, the captain said. They were trying to burn these. Adrian broke the first seal. Inside were copies of intercepted letters. His breath caught. They were letters Evelyn had written during the war. Letters he had never received. One read, "I know you're carrying the weight of the kingdom. Please don't carry it alone. Whatever frightens you, let me face it beside you." Another ended with, "I still dream about the family we'll build when peace returns." Adrian closed his eyes. She had reached for him, again and again. Someone had made sure her words never found him. The captain unfolded a faded map. "There is more. Our investigation uncovered references to a secret organization. They call themselves the Black Crescent Council." Adrian frowned. "I've never heard the name. That was their intention." The captain pointed to a series of coded symbols. For generations, they influenced kings from the shadows. They believed rulers without strong families were easier to manipulate. They spread fear. They forged reports. They intercepted messages. They convinced leaders that love was a weakness. Another officer stepped forward, carrying a leather ledger. We questioned one of their messengers. He admitted they exaggerated assassination threats. They fed false intelligence into the palace for years. Adrian's hands tightened around the papers. "They knew I feared losing my family," the captain nodded. "And they turned that fear into a weapon. Every warning Adrian had received suddenly looked different. every report insisting that an heir would invite disaster, every recommendation urging secrecy and emotional distance. The fear had been real, but someone had carefully fed it until it consumed his judgment. He remembered Evelyn's tearful smile on the day they discussed children for the last time. He had changed the subject, not because he wanted to hurt her, because he believed silence would keep her safe. Now he saw the truth. His silence had never belonged to him. It had been cultivated by people who benefited from a lonely king. Adrian rose from his chair. Arrest every noble connected to this council. Seize their records. I want every victim they manipulated identified. The captain bowed. At once, Your Majesty. As the officers hurried away, one young scout remained behind. There is one final report. He placed a folded parchment on the desk. It came from the Western Mountains. Adrian unfolded it slowly. A healer known as Lady Eve had transformed a forgotten valley. She had rebuilt homes, taught children, healed the sick. The description was simple, but one detail caught his attention. The healer always wore a silver comb shaped like a crescent moon. It had once belonged to Queen Evelyn's mother. Adrian stared at the page. For nearly 2 years he had searched for a missing queen. Instead, he had found a woman who no longer needed a crown to change the lives around her. He looked toward the dawn, breaking beyond the palace windows. This time, when he went to find Evelyn, he would not go seeking the queen he had lost. He would go seeking the woman he had finally learned to understand. Adrian left the capital before sunrise. He took no royal procession, no banner bearing the crest of the Moon Kingdom. Only one trusted horse carried him west, toward the distant valley, where a healer called Lady Eve had quietly changed hundreds of lives. The journey lasted 6 days. Each mile carried him farther from the throne he had hidden behind for so long. On the afternoon of the 7th day, he reached the valley. It was more beautiful than the reports had described. Apple trees stretched across the hillsides. Children laughed as they chased one another between rows of vegetables. Homes that had once been little more than burned foundations now stood strong beneath fresh timber roofs. Hope lived there, not because a king had ordered it, because someone had patiently built it with her own hands. A shout suddenly echoed from the eastern slope. The hillside! Help! Adrian turned. A section of loose earth had collapsed after days of heavy rain. Several villagers were trapped beneath fallen branches and broken stone. Without thinking, he ran toward them. At the center of the rescue stood a woman, directing everyone with calm confidence. Lift together. Careful of his leg. Bring more clean water. Though her cloak was plain, and her hands were stained with dirt, Adrian recognized her immediately. Evelyn. She looked healthier than he had ever seen her. The worry lines that had once shadowed her face were gone. When the last injured child was carried to safety, she finally looked up. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world fell silent. You finally found the valley, she said gently. Adrian managed a faint smile. I almost wish I hadn't. She tilted her head. Why? He looked around at the thriving village. Because now I understand what my kingdom stole from you. Evelyn studied him for a long moment. Then she gestured toward a bench beneath a flowering apple tree. Walk with me. They spoke until the sun drifted low across the mountains. Adrian told her everything. The intercepted letters, his father's diary, the Black Crescent Council, his own failure to question the fear that had ruled his heart. When he finished, silence settled between them. I never stopped loving you, he said quietly. I know, Evelyn replied. That was never the problem. She met his gaze without anger. You loved me, but you didn't trust me enough to stand beside you. His shoulders sagged. You're right. She looked toward the children playing nearby. I spent years believing I wasn't enough. Then I realized I had never been given the chance to choose. Adrian swallowed hard. Come home with me. Evelyn's eyes softened with sadness. I can't. You don't trust me, he whispered. I don't, she answered honestly. And trust doesn't return simply because someone apologizes. The villagers had slowly gathered nearby, sensing something important was unfolding. Adrian reached up and removed the royal crown from his head. Without ceremony, he placed it gently on the ground before everyone. If being king is the reason I became a man who made your choices for you, he stepped back from the crown, then I would rather learn how to deserve you without it. A murmur spread through the crowd. Evelyn looked at the man standing before her. Not the victorious Alpha King, not the ruler of the Moon Kingdom, just Adrian. She took a slow breath. Go back, she said softly, not to keep your crown, to prove you know how to wear it. When the kingdom reflects the lessons you've learned, then come and find me again. Adrian bowed his head. For the first time in years, he understood that earning forgiveness would not begin with words. It would begin with the life he chose to lead after leaving her. Adrian returned to the capital alone. The crown rested upon his head once more. But it no longer felt like a symbol of authority. It felt like a responsibility. Every promise he had made beneath the apple tree echoed through his mind. He would not ask Evelyn to trust words. He would give her reasons to trust actions. The very next morning, the royal council assembled. The nobles expected discussions about trade and rebuilding after the war. Instead, Adrian stood before the throne with a stack of sealed decrees. The kingdom will change, he announced, and it begins today. The first decree dissolved the Black Crescent Council forever. Every noble connected to the secret organization was arrested and brought to trial. Their hidden records were opened to the public. Families learned the truth about years of lies, manipulated reports, and stolen letters. The second decree transformed the laws of the kingdom. No alpha, Adrian declared, including the king, may make decisions that shape a family's future without the knowledge and consent of their mate. The council chamber erupted in whispers. Some older nobles objected. It weakens the authority of the throne. Adrian met their protests without raising his voice. No, it strengthens the trust upon which the throne stands. His words ended the debate. The decree passed. Next came the formation of a new royal council. For the first time in the kingdom's history, mothers, healers, teachers, and war veterans received permanent seats beside generals and nobles. The wisdom to protect a kingdom, Adrian said, does not belong only to those who carry swords. Over the following months, more reforms followed. Letters between soldiers and their families were protected by law. Widows received lifelong support. Children orphaned by war were given homes and education. The palace itself changed. The great doors that had once seemed distant and imposing opened each week to ordinary citizens. Their voices were finally heard. A full year passed. Only then did Adrian leave the capital once more. He carried no royal decree, no jeweled gifts, no guards. In his hands was a small wooden cradle. Its smooth rails had been carefully carved with tiny moonflowers. When he reached the valley, Evelyn found him sitting beneath the same apple tree where they had parted. She noticed the cradle first. You kept it, she whispered. Adrian nodded. I built it years ago. I hid it away because I convinced myself fear was wisdom. He gently placed the cradle between them. I don't know if we'll ever have children. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me completely. His voice trembled. But if our future is empty, I want it to be because we chose it together. Evelyn looked at the cradle for a long time. Then she looked at the man before her. Gone was the king who believed love should be protected through silence. In his place stood a man who had learned that love could survive only through honesty. She stepped forward. Slowly, she reached for his hand. Her fingers closed around his. I can't erase the past, she said softly. Neither can I, Adrian replied. A gentle smile touched her lips. Then let's stop trying. She lifted the cradle between them. From this day forward, we'll choose our future together. Beneath the blossoms drifting from the apple trees, Adrian smiled through grateful tears. This time, they were not beginning as king and queen. They were beginning as two hearts, finally walking the same path by choice. When Adrian and Evelyn returned to the capital, the palace bells rang from every tower. The people filled the streets. Some expected a grand celebration. Others wondered if their queen had truly forgiven the king who had once broken her heart. Evelyn stepped from the carriage beside Adrian. She wore a simple silver gown instead of her old ceremonial robes. The royal crown rested lightly upon her head, not as a symbol of ownership, but as a sign of a responsibility she had freely chosen to accept. Adrian took her hand before the gathered crowd. He did not speak first. Instead, he waited for Evelyn. She stepped forward. "I have not returned because the past disappeared," she said. "I have returned because the future belongs to both of us." The square fell silent. No family should ever be built upon silence. No marriage should ever ask one heart to carry every decision. Her words spread through the kingdom faster than any royal decree. Within weeks, the palace announced sweeping reforms. Every royal decision affecting the king's or queen's family required the agreement of both. The same principle extended throughout the kingdom. Pack leaders could no longer make life-changing family decisions without consulting their mates. Marriage was recognized not as obedience, but as partnership. Evelyn also established the House of Open Voices inside the palace. There, couples facing difficult choices could meet with experienced mothers, healers, elders, and veterans before making decisions together. The program quickly became one of the kingdom's greatest successes. Arguments that once ended families now became conversations. Fear no longer ruled in silence. It was faced together. Adrian kept his promise as well. Every month, he opened the royal council chambers to ordinary citizens. Farmers sat beside nobles. Teachers spoke before generals. Young mothers shared ideas with ministers. The kingdom slowly learned that wisdom could come from any voice willing to speak honestly. One afternoon, Evelyn visited the village school just outside the capital. A young girl raised her hand. "Your Majesty?" Evelyn smiled. "Yes? My father says you're the queen. My mother says you're the king's equal. Which one is true?" The classroom grew quiet. Evelyn walked to the little girl's desk and knelt beside her. "They're both true." She glanced toward the window, where Adrian was laughing with a group of children planting new trees. A crown doesn't make one person greater than another. It reminds us to serve together. The little girl grinned. "I like that better." "So do I," Evelyn replied. Years passed, and the kingdom flourished. Neighboring rulers traveled great distances to study the reforms Adrian and Evelyn had created. Many returned home determined to build stronger partnerships within their own courts. The people noticed something else. Whenever difficult decisions arose, the king and queen never announced them separately. They stood side by side. They listened before speaking. They questioned before deciding. They trusted before leading. In time, the people gave Evelyn a title no royal ceremony had ever bestowed. It was spoken in villages, marketplaces, and castle halls with deep affection. The queen who listened first. She accepted it with quiet gratitude. Because after everything she had lost, she knew the greatest gift she could offer her kingdom was not perfect answers. It was the courage to ensure that every voice, especially the ones closest to her heart, would always be heard before the future was chosen. Many years passed. Peace settled over the Moon Kingdom, like the gentle glow of a full moon. The scars of war slowly faded. Children who had once known only fear now grew up beneath orchards planted by their parents. The kingdom flourished, not because it had become perfect, but because its people had learned to face hardship together. King Adrian and Queen Evelyn ruled side by side. They disagreed sometimes, They questioned one another often, but they never again allowed silence to decide what love deserved. On the anniversary of their return to the palace, the Royal Hall of History opened a new exhibit. Visitors expected to see jeweled crowns, golden swords, ancient battle armor. Those treasures were there, yet the largest crowd gathered before something far simpler: a small wooden cradle. Its polished rails were carved with delicate moonflowers. Its wood had darkened with age, but every careful detail remained untouched. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Why is that old cradle in the royal hall?" Before she could answer, Queen Evelyn approached with King Adrian beside her. Though silver now touched their hair, kindness still filled their eyes. Evelyn smiled at the child. "Because this cradle reminds us that the future should never belong to fear." The boy looked confused, but there was never a baby in it. "No," Adrian answered softly, "and that's exactly why it matters." The visitors turned toward him. "I built this cradle years before anyone knew it existed. I hid it because I believed loving my family meant denying myself one." He lowered his gaze for a moment. "I thought silence would protect the woman I loved. It only broke her heart." Evelyn reached for his hand, and when he finally brought it to me, he didn't ask me to fill it. He asked me to choose our future with him. She looked around the hall. Whether that future included children or not was never the most important question. The important question was whether we would decide it together. The room fell silent. Nearby stood the moonstone throne. Beneath it, a new inscription had been carved into white marble for every future ruler to read. "The greatest mistake I ever made was believing silence could protect the people I loved." Below Adrian's words, another inscription had been added in Evelyn's graceful handwriting. "Love cannot survive where one heart makes every decision." Young princes and princesses copied the words into their journals. Future alphas memorized them before taking their vows. The lessons born from one broken marriage became the foundation of a stronger kingdom. As evening settled, Adrian and Evelyn stepped onto the palace balcony. The same moon that had watched Evelyn leave before dawn now shone over a kingdom transformed by honesty. Adrian smiled. "Do you ever regret coming back?" Evelyn leaned gently against him. "Never." She looked across the peaceful city below. "The night I overheard your promise ended the life we thought we wanted." She squeezed his hand. "But the truth we finally shared gave us a better one." History never forgot the cruel promise an Alpha King made behind closed doors. But it remembered something far greater. The day a king learned that love is never protected by silence, only by two hearts brave enough to choose the future together.